Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Wednesday, November 14th, and I'm sitting down to talk about a few different things today. At the top of my list, we're going to talk about Mercury's square to Neptune right now. And this is especially interesting given that Mercury is about to turn retrograde. And turning retrograde in a square to Neptune is kind of a big deal. It's a big deal because the Mercury retrograde cycle that sort of begins at the station, you could say, the retrograde portion of the cycle that begins at the stationing point that's happening right now, in a square with Neptune is toning the entire sort of cycle. So I think that this is a big deal to talk about. I think it's really important. I'm going to kind of try to separate or isolate this from a couple of other events that are happening over the next few days. So there'll be a couple more talks to come if you're sitting down going like, I hope he's going to talk about Mars entering Pisces, or I hope that he's going to talk about Venus turning direct or something like that, or Mars square Jupiter. There's a lot to talk about this week because there's a lot going on. Let's run down the list just so you have a sense. Okay, first of all, Mercury square Neptune and about to turn retrograde in debilitated sign of Sagittarius. We've already done a 3-part series on Jupiter having just entered Sagittarius. And then you've got Mars about to shift signs into Pisces and square Jupiter in Sagittarius. That's happening in the next couple of days. Venus is about to turn direct again in Libra. Going to push through an opposition one last time with Uranus by the end of the month. Uranus, by the way, clearly at that last anaretic degree of Aries. How about that? You've got Jupiter bumping into a fire sign, Uranus scooting back into the 29th intense degree of fire sign Aries, and Mars culminating. And apparently most of the West Coast is literally burning down. So, I mean, this is like, it's so intense. Now, what to speak of all the, here in the US, the issues in politics and mass shootings. And I mean, it's just the past couple of weeks, I've had clients literally talking to me about intense kinds of fears and anxieties coming up. And in almost every session, I've just taken a moment to be like, well, let's just acknowledge, right, that we are, for 2 weeks, if you've turned on the news on an unconscious or subconscious level, we're letting a lot of intense images and events in. So a little extra anxiety right now. All of this happening is normal. But gosh, it's hard to separate sometimes the fear and anxiety that we're feeling from the stuff going on in the world these days because it's so prevalent. It's so you're inundated by it if you turn on any kind of media. Not that you should necessarily be ignoring it either, but I mean, it's just like, how do you find peace, right? So at any rate, and then as if all of this, isn't enough, then you've got right in the midst of this, Mercury is square Neptune and turning retrograde. So a lot of stuff going on. We're going to talk today about Mercury's station, its retrograde, its stability in Jupiter's sign of Sagittarius. We're going to talk about its square to Neptune and just generally some things to watch for. Then I want to tell you about a new talk that I just came out today, and that is on the ancient meanings of the houses, or the original meanings of the houses. My friend and colleague Nadia Shah, who has a popular YouTube channel, also was very sweet enough to start a series spotlighting other astrologers. Nadia will be a guest in my Winter Speaker Series program, so it's a program that's dedicated to the divine feminine. It'll be 3 women who are speaking on the divine feminine, and Nadia will be there, Demetra George will be there, and Kelly Surtees will be a part of that program in the winter. I'm really excited about it. But at any rate, I invited Nadia to come to this program this winter specifically because she was good enough to invite me to be her November guest astrologer of the month on her YouTube channel. So she said, hey, will you do something for my channel, and I'd love to, kind of spotlight your work. And I was like, hey, that's really cool. Yeah. And so what I did was an 1 and 40-minute long class on the original meanings of the houses. I'm going to put that link to this right. I'm going to put it into the chat box right now. And if you're watching this on YouTube, it will be in the comments section. But here it is right here. You can check it out and watch like basically an hour and 40-minute long class on a hypothesis concerning why the third house is related to siblings, or why the fifth house is related to pregnancy and children, or why the sixth house is sometimes related to drudgery and hard work. Where did these things originally come from? Believe it or not, they do not come from the association with the 12 signs. Someone might be like, well, the third house is related to communication because of Gemini. And you say, well, why is Gemini related to communication? They say Mercury. And you say, well, why is Mercury related to communication? And they say, well, the third house. And it gets to be a little circular. And we conflate all of these meanings of planets, houses, and signs together in modern astrology when perhaps we shouldn't. Ancient astrologers do not appear to have done that. And so this is a class that you can take. It's about an hour and 40 minutes that gives you a preview of a much longer, almost 20 hours worth of lectures and talks that are a part of my one-year program, which is beginning in December, that covers the original topical designations of the houses in greater depth. So the hypothesis, you get a preview of it in this class, though, which is on Nadia's channel. So I thought you guys might want to check that out, and check out Nadia's work too, because she's awesome. So you can find that in the chat box here. The YouTube link is there. I will be posting it. I'll be sending the link in my daily newsletter after I download today's video and put it on my YouTube channel. So you'll also be able to, if you're watching on YouTube, you can find that link in the, I'll put it in the body of the description of the video for the day. So I wanted to talk about that. I'm not going to go into that, the topic per se, but I'm linking you to it today. Finally, I have two really good Q&A questions from readers and viewers that I'll be addressing after we talk about Mercury and Neptune. And to give you a preview of those questions, they are: Alex, who is a yoga instructor, wants to know what are 2 or 3 good things that I feel I've incorporated from modern astrology into a practice or study of traditional astrology, and also what are several things from traditional astrology that I might consider not so great, or maybe something to be skeptical about, and then vice versa. What are some things from modern understanding that I really don't like, and what are some ways that traditional understandings might improve upon certain modern concepts? So that's a really interesting question and fun. So I'm going to talk about that after we talk about Mercury and Neptune today. And then the other question that I got, interestingly enough, from another yoga teacher named Kat Rose, who, by the way, I did a little, sometimes I'll, like stalk my readers a little bit. I'm like, that, someone has an interesting profile name or something like that. I'm like, who is this? Someone's a yoga teacher or whatever. So I found out Kat Rose has a YouTube channel that's like apparently for creative introverts. It looks really interesting. So I'm going to have to check that out. She contacted me through YouTube. And the question that she has is, as a new yoga teacher, she's wondering if there are any creative or effective ways to integrate yoga asana practice with astrology. So we're going to talk about that as well. If you have a yoga practice, is there any way that astrology can kind of cross over and help your yoga practice, or if you're a yoga teacher, what to do about that? So that's where we'll be heading in Q&A after we get through Mercury and Neptune. So let's talk about Mercury and Neptune. First of all, let's talk about Mercury in the sign of Sagittarius. This is one of 2 places where Mercury is considered debilitated. What do we mean by debilitated? Because the word freaks people out, right? And as soon as you say debilitated, everyone wants to say that there's no such thing as a bad planet. There's no such thing as a bad placement. There's no such thing as bad, right? I think this gets really extreme. I'm actually, something I'm going to talk about when I talk about modern versus traditional astrology. Look, ancient astrology is not afraid to have different kinds of planetary designations, like debilitated or exalted, or in its home place, or sort of in exile in another place, fallen or depressed, exalted or lifted up. Why do they use this language? Quite simply because the material world mirrors these kinds of experiences for us all the time. The planets are mirroring the experiences that we have in the material world. For example, if you are walking down the road and you're Stephen King, right? And you get struck by a van, which actually happened to him sometime, I think it was a while ago now, but he was struck by a van and thrown into a deep depression off the side of the road. He has Mars, god of accidents and injuries, right on his ascendant, which is his health line, in its fall in Cancer. That designation for a classical, or someone who studies ancient astrology, immediately tells you that there can be serious health problems and there can be accidents, and there, like this can be a part of someone's karmic destiny. That doesn't mean it's good or bad, but it does it warrants a description that is subjectively agreed upon as bad. Like 99% of people aren't going to like, getting hit by vans. So we have a language in place in ancient astrology to help us understand the ups and downs of karma in the material world. The project, the spiritual project, is to learn how to remain in a healthy state of detachment and acceptance, regardless of if we're riding up or coming down. That's what the study of ancient astrology is all about. I say this in almost every video that I make, just to remind people that astrology is not about trying to make you, feel really, really great about X, Y, and Z in the material world. The whole purpose is to help you study the fluctuations and changes of the material world so you become more aware of impermanence. And in exchange, becoming aware of impermanence, you can start to take up transcendental activities. So that's the goal. So why do we need debilitated, like words like a debilitated planet? Because it describes things in the world that most of us would subjectively agree upon as difficult, challenging, sometimes even, yes, bad. Okay, that does not mean that there is not also an understanding in ancient astrology of things being beyond the duality of good and bad, painful and blissful, etc. But the language of understand, again, the language of the planets in the birth chart is describing the material world of karma, has to have the capacity to describe ups and downs. It's also why we have the malefic and benefic distinctions, like Mars and Saturn being malefics and benefics like Jupiter and Venus. But of course, just to remind everybody, benefics can harm and malefics can help. And that's flexible going way back. But there's also usually specific contexts in which they can help or harm, and vice versa. So learning all of this is a really beautiful and interesting part of sort of learning the deeper science of astrology. Now, Mercury, when it's in the sign of Sagittarius, is debilitated because it's in its opposite sign. It's natural. It's in the sign opposite to its own natural sign. The sign that it's home to is Gemini or Virgo. When it goes into Pisces or Sagittarius, it's in a debilitated place. Why is it debilitated? Because it's in Jupiter's sign. What's the beef between Mercury and Jupiter? Very important to understand. Let's say that you are someone who goes on a like overseas vacation of some kind, or an overseas spiritual retreat. When you come back, generally speaking, what you say is, I just had my horizons were expanded. I just like sort of expanded my mind, and my life just got bigger, and now I have more of the world sort of encompassed within me. So if you go to India, you go to South America, you go to Europe, you go to Asia, someplace, Africa, what happens when you get back? Your world feels a little bit bigger. It feels a little bit more whole. It feels a little bit more complete. You get the sense of having grown. That's all Jupiter stuff. This is why Jupiter is often associated with traveling. It has nothing to do with Sagittarius per se. Jupiter in either sign, Pisces or Sagittarius, has to do with that kind of expansiveness, that sense of something getting bigger or wiser or more all-encompassing. It's grandiose. It has the sense of reaching beyond where it currently is to encompass or contain more. Okay, fine. Everyone knows that experience, right? Mercury, on the other hand, is a lot different. So let's say that you are you're in a university setting, right? And you're in a politics, you're in a classroom that's about, U.S. politics, the history of U.S. politics or whatever. And throughout that course, the the teacher has a very specific stance, and you have a stance that's very different from the teacher's. And the teacher is teaching the material in a way that you take issue with because you have a different perspective. What tends to happen is that your way of taking in that information that you're receiving is going to be to break it apart, to take it apart into pieces, to look at it, to criticize it, to examine it, to talk back, to go back and forth. The teacher makes a claim that's very certain. You're that voice of dissent in the classroom. You throw it up in the air. You throw that claim up in the air and you say, well, maybe, or da 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 da. If you've ever been a teacher, there's nothing more maddening, for example, on some level, right? Because I've taught in a lot of different settings. There's nothing more maddening than trying to get a simple point across, right, that everyone should agree upon. What to speak of some, stuff that maybe you have much more of an intense bias about, but just something general like the sky is blue today or whatever, when you've always got someone in the classroom who says, I don't know. And they throw that certainty up in the air. And it's like, like, okay, so for example, people who, right, there's a movement going on. It's actually a very real thing where people question whether the earth is round or not. They're called flat earthers. Some of you may have heard of this before. And this is something like consensus reality from physicists to even mystics to whatever are like, hey, the earth is round. And these people are like, I don't know. I'm pretty sure every event that happens that's bad in the media now is, it's a conspiracy. The aliens are coming. The earth is flat and nothing is real. And right, like, so this intense form of scrutinizing, doubting, taking things apart, throwing into question. There's a positive and negative side to that, right? On the positive side, if someone's full of hot air and they're trying to strong arm a position or a perspective or something like that, Mercury's really nice because Mercury comes in and just says, like let's hold up and just talk about this a little bit. But if, on the other hand, someone's trying to present consensus reality, just bring more people together, and you have that one person who would rather pick on a tiny little detail that's going to end up becoming divisive, well, that's more of a problem, right? So these are the kinds of things that Mercury and Jupiter deal with when they're in each other's signs. That's why they're said to be in exile or detriment in one another's signs. It's as though you're in somebody's house as a house guest for dinner, and you are just night and day different from that individual. And you're trying to have a nice dinner together. It's going to be a little challenging. So you can think about Mercury in Jupiter's sign, for example, as representing different kinds of extremes, making puffed up claims without details or evidence, making overly critical claims that kill someone's spirit rather than building them up in a moment where it's really a much better option to just build them up. Not wanting to receive criticism because we're too proud, or on the other hand, being too proud of our technical intellect to be supportive. So those kinds of just sort of mental communicative tensions can be really pronounced during a time like this. So that's one way of thinking about Mercury in Jupiter's sign. The other thing can be about intellectual hubris or mental pride. On the other hand, there can be a condemnation of critical thinking that is not okay. For example, there is a time when I'm trying to, this very specific moment that my daughter and I will reach, when I'm trying to explain to her why she needs to do something. And then it'll get to a point, I think like all parents know this point, and I'm realizing this as a young parent, is you're hearing your own parent's voice in your head and you're like, because I said so, you little shit. You know what I mean? You get to that point where it's like they could infinitely regress beyond the starting point of the universe with their questions about why they need to do something as simple as going to bed so that their body doesn't collapse. You know what I mean? You're just because I said so, because it's just a higher authority and you just have to listen to me because I'm your parent. I just know better and I can't, and I actually can't remember if it was Louis C.K. back in the day or some comedian that I heard that had a really funny way of presenting this with his kids, where he infinitely regressed through the philosophy of the universe or something. So there are times when our intellect just needs to quiet itself to listen to a higher authority. And on the other hand, there are times when the higher authority needs to question and encourage, or needs to encourage the questioner, so that the questioner can grow their mind and their understanding. But the tension between those things can be really difficult. Lisa's mentioning getting almost thrown out of Sunday school class. This is the perfect, like, Mercury and Sagittarius is like that tension between the, can God make a burrito so hot that even he can't eat it? And the teacher who's either like, that's a really interesting question, let's get into that, great imagination that you have. Or on the other hand, the teacher that's like, get out of here, God doesn't like questions. You know what I mean? Like, but that tension is like, okay, so it's here right now, and it can be for better or for worse. You can feel into that tension right now. One of the most daring things that we can do is dare to be corrected. One of my teachers uses the quote, says it's a saintly person that says, I live to be corrected. I live to be corrected. It's a daring thing to do in this age where anyone is the authority. Everything is true. There's no longer an emphasis on, experts of the law or academics or scholars or people who've been studying things for a long time speaking to things. Now it's anyone and everyone who has a Twitter account, right? And that's bad, and it's good. It's very Mercury and Sagittarius kind of thing, because authority can limit the freedom of the mind. But on the other hand, the freedom of the mind without any respect for higher authority can just shoot off a lot and just be really actually sort of proud and unintelligent. So this kind of tension also between, where do I seek or find higher authority? Can I dare to be corrected? Can I dare to be wrong about something? It's a difficult world we live in when we can't even, we almost feel like it's an insult to suggest that there is a truth. Can you believe that? Someone might say, oh, you believe that there's one truth here, one objective, clear truth? Oh, well, you must be evil, right? But that's where it's gone to a certain extent. Consensus reality, in some ways, has become a cesspool of hyper-subjectivity and lots of opinions, such that higher truth and authority it's almost looked at as an evil. Like, that's not good. But on the other hand, we have lived through periods of history where people can abuse power. They can use ideas as weapons to harm others and things like that. And any questioning was persecuted, right? So there's some wounds around that historically, but we also have to be very careful we're not swinging to the opposite extreme where there's just no such thing as truth any longer. And then ironically, that's the only thing we believe is true. There's still an intense dogma behind that. And these are some of the intricacies of, Mercury and Sagittarius that you could say come up. Especially because Jupiter's just entered Sagittarius. And so now we have, the maestro himself, Zeus. He's like in his home place. And, so he's there to really get into it with Mercury at the moment. Mercury is falling under the beams of the sun, but guess what? So is Jupiter. It's an old Jupiter right now. The sun is about to conjoin Jupiter, which means, sort of metaphorically, this is like an old Jupiter. It can be very wise. It can also represent the death of teachers, the death of teachings, the death of old ideas, the death of an old version of authority. And that's before Jupiter's really going to hit on more of those notes of expansiveness and youthfulness and the spring-like qualities. It's got to go through this conjunction with the sun first, which sort of burns it up and starts the process new. And then Zeus is reborn. It's a lot younger, but Mercury's got to go through that process right now too. Mercury's going to go retrograde, fall back into the beams of the sun, sort of conflagrate, get set on fire with the sun, and then it switches over to the morning star. So there's something in Mercury that's dying right now, and there's something in Jupiter that's dying right now. They're both in Jupiter's sign, but there's some level of naive, pompous understanding that might be ready to die within us. There's some level which we thought we knew, we thought we had the truth, but now maybe we're ready to be humbled. Those kinds of things could be happening. On the other hand, we could see the usefulness of certain kinds of ideas just no longer working, just no longer being of service, and ready to be let go of and implanted in the heart new ideas that can take our faith, our service in the world to another level. We can also look at arguments and debates that we're no longer interested in. We can think about, those things that we get on about, and it's like the thing that you can't help but find a way to talk about and argue about and get fired up about at least a couple times a week. We all have those. They're like, our little soapboxes that we keep coming back to. It might be time for our soapboxes to change. Maybe they don't ever go away, right? But it might be time for a new soapbox, a new passionate idea that sort of seizes you and you get intense about, or a new study, a new form of study. But both Mercury and Jupiter dying suggests the sort of end of an era related to the mind, belief, faith, ideals, and also the tensions between our own subjective mind and opinions and personal ideas and experiences and those of higher authorities that we can trust or not trust. So those relationships are going to be intense for a little bit right now as well. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what's going on with Mercury and Jupiter, but Mercury's also right now about to turn retrograde in a square with Neptune in a water sign. So first of all, I'm kind of hopeful, like honestly, with Mercury going to a square with Neptune, I'm like kind of hopeful just in a very literal sense that might mean something about the fires. Think about it symbolically. The fires are about to retreat, go backward, thanks to an encounter with Neptune in Pisces, which is the waters. So I looked at that and I thought, wouldn't that be nice if this retrograde over the next few days brought rain, brought this kind of a downpour to the states that are experiencing these horrible forest fires? And wouldn't it be interesting then if you see Mercury in the fire sign retreating as a symbol of the end or the dousing of the fire? That would be kind of hopeful. So maybe, but speaking outside of the literal sort of mundane events, there's a lot of fire in the sky right now. Mercury in a fire sign, Jupiter in a fire sign, Uranus back in that anaretic degree in Aries. So the other thing that's more practical than sort of personal, I should say, than mundane is this idea that you're going into a stage where your mind is going to have to look right into the waters of Neptune. And that's crazy, right? This is sort of like there's no Mercury's in its fall in Pisces, for example. This is a difficult place for the mind to go to. So I want to talk about a few things. One very interesting quote that I heard yesterday is there was a famous guru was once asked by a reporter. He said, well, if you're so enlightened, then tell us how many windows there are on the Empire State Building. Kind of an unfair question, very sort of Mercury and Sagittarius, right? And the guru responded with a really, I think, intelligent, wise response. And he responded with a question. And he said, you tell me, how many drops of water are there in a mirage? How many drops of water are there in a mirage? The point, obviously, being that this superficial test of knowledge, a superficial test of wisdom or of greatness in the material world, a question like this is a superficial test of wisdom or knowledge. And that is an enlightened response. Okay, on one sense, if you're the reporter, you're sort of like Mercury, you could feel really cheated by that response. You could be like, you didn't answer my question, But if you really are looking for an answer, that answer is also, in a sense, it's the true answer. the number of windows in the Empire State Building doesn't matter, and my knowledge of that is not what constitutes being enlightened. Not that this person was claiming to be enlightened either, but in this material world that we live in, there are all different kinds of ways to build ourselves up as, powerful, important, special. When we build, palaces of happiness, so many of them come back to the power of my voice, the power of how much people take me seriously, how intelligent am I, how much have I read, how much do I know, how articulate am I, So in yogic studies, we talk about, in Bhakti Yoga, we talk about a category of yoga called jnana. And jnana yoga basically means the sort of yoga of wisdom or knowledge. And in one way, when we develop our minds, we can become very wise, and the mind can sort of slice through all different kinds of things in the world and sort of become powerful. And but one of the and by doing this, if one continues questioning and questioning and questioning, it's said that one can come to realization of the divine. You can actually use your mind in a sense to come to a realization that there is divinity, whatever you want to call it. But there's a warning in the Bhakti tradition about jnana, which is that the natural propensity of the heart and soul, spirit soul, is to love, to be attached to something. And whereas one of the ways that the mind has of building knowledge and strength is through negation, not this, not that, not this, not that. And so I've said this in a lot of my talks before, but it's very important that we not base our sense of strength or happiness in the world upon some imagined position of intellectual or intellectual greatness. In this sort of digital age that we live in, right, the more information that you have, the better. The quicker you are with technology, the better. The more up to speed or up to date you are with technology, the better. This is a different version of the same kind of potential mercurial hubris. It's that I have lots of knowledge, I have lots of books, I have lots of intellectual strength. Also, I have more information. I'm quicker, faster, more clever. I'm more sarcastic. I'm wittier. I'm less able to be pinned down like that. But all of these things, right, in a sense, they don't bring us to any greater sense of love and attachment in our heart and soul to the divine than knowing how many windows in the Empire State Building would make you intelligent. Do you know what I mean? So there's a lot of mindless trivia in the world, and there's a lot of sort of mindless there's a lot of mindless information as well. And this is a moment where it's a really, with a square to Neptune, which has the power to dissolve, to dampen, and to even just pour water on the fire of mental or informational hubris and pride. There's a real opportunity right now to tune out of unhealthy streams of information, or to have the mind humbled again by something vast, something mysterious, something magical. It's a good time to see symbols and omens in dreams. It's a good time for those synchronistic encounters that come and speak to us. It's a good time to, I wrote an article just a few days ago after an I Ching reading that had to do with a picture in the I Ching reading, and I did the reading for this Mercury Neptune square. In the reading, one of the hexagrams was gentle restraint, which is hexagram 9, and it shows a person basically like looking up at these foreboding clouds, and it's like rain's coming, but it's not here yet. And there's this sense too right now of the intensity, the passion, the excitement, and the enthusiasm of Mercury in Sagittarius and Jupiter in Sagittarius, and wanting to do something or say something. This is a more impulsive, fiery energy, and to get sort of lit up by information, to get overly stimulated and hyped up really quickly, like all of that's there. But this hexagram very much has it very much gives the message of saying, just wait, Just hold back, watch and listen and learn, and be very careful about the making, impulsive decisions or jumping to conclusions. It's very easy to be misunderstood right now, or to miscommunicate, to not see things as they are, to make, big mental errors because of you look around, you scan, and then you make this quick decision. You interpret the information. Mercury's role as an interpreter, and then you just go off and into taking immediate reactive, making immediate reactive choices. With Neptune in the mix right now, is very easy to have everything kind of fall apart, and for the water to just get poured right, sort of right on top of you, if you're acting, too sort of recklessly in that sense. So you have to be really careful, because it's a time where you can really misread the signs. You think you know what they are, you're anticipating, and then you want to run ahead. Be very, very careful of that, because Neptune is a deep teacher in that regard, with saying you're an illusion. You don't know what really matters. You're not paying attention to what's really substantive and important. Your mind is on fire with its own, sort of cocky, reactive immediacy. Just chill a little bit. So you have to be very careful for that. On the other hand, signs, omens, visions, non-ordinary states of consciousness, meditation, dreams, these things right now can inform us and direct our passion and our intelligence to begin some kind of revisioning process, an editing process. We might see the gathering clouds, so to speak, or an omen or a dream may come, and it may give us room to pause. And with that pause, then Mercury, you can imagine Mercury starting to go retrograde. Some process of going inward may occur, or some process of revision may occur, or starting to lead ourselves into a deeper space of questioning can happen, all of which can be very positive. In other words, but we have to take that step of catching ourselves before we fly off the handle in illusion land. Something to think about right now. So daring to be corrected, being careful of impulsive choices, watching the signs, being a careful and patient observer, distinguishing between mirages and useful information, as well as what makes us intelligent, what is real intelligence, how does it connect with the heart versus some kind of more egotistical level of intelligence. Being careful about what we allow to stimulate us in our nervous system or our minds, as well as allowing for inspiration from otherworldly or non-ordinary places to come through. All stuff that can take place with Mercury square Neptune. So those are some big things to think about in the next couple of days as Mercury is ready to turn retrograde. Another thing that is worth mentioning is technology. This is so simple and basic, but it bears repeating. Mercury retrograde means that Mercury is going backward through the zodiac. What has been gained in forward movement through the zodiac is now being given up. So there are typically reversals of fortune that come with Mercury retrogrades. It's not necessarily that Mercury is going to melt things down or mess you up or interfere. It's that there are reversals. So you buy a ticket, you can't make the flight on time, or you get into a plane and it sits on the tarmac for a while because there's a delay. Delays more common around the stations. Breakdowns and reversals more common while it's moving retrograde. Momentum changes for the better, recovery more typical around the station direct. But right now we're getting into the station point, which means things can slow down, stop working. For example, here's a perfect example. When we bought this house, there's a small hot tub out back, which was like a total bonus because we're not, people who would be able to afford going out and buying a hot tub or anything. But it came with the house. We were like, oh, cool, a hot tub. It's a bonus, especially for a house that's in our budget and everything. And hot tub, right? I go out there. I'm going to go in with my daughter a couple of nights ago, and sort of my first time going out in since the colder air has come in. I kind of got it all fired up. I cleaned it and everything. And there's a light blinking, right? And basically what had happened was the engine had overheated. So literally, you have Mercury and square Neptune, a whirlpool, whose engine heater had overheated and could melt down unless we turned off the power. Look, is a super simple example of Mercury stationing in a fire sign in a square to Neptune in a water sign. So similarly, you have to be really careful. Be careful when you keep water around your electronics. Honestly, sometimes it's that simple. Like, just be careful not to have cups of water right next to your keyboard, or don't bring your phone into the bathtub, or you know what I mean? Like, be very careful about those kinds of things. And you also don't neglect things that could malfunction or sort of short circuit. You're like, well, there's standing water in my basement, and there's like cords that are sitting in it, and it's it's not a big deal. I'll go take care of it in a couple of hours or something. So like, I don't know who would really do that, but you get the point. Be very careful about technology, especially keeping water around technology. The other thing is that you might see really sort of imaginative, big, exciting ideas that people are trying to sell you on very persuasively that may actually not work. So for example, right now, someone's trying to sell you something. I'll give you another example. I had a guy call me yesterday trying to sell me. I had him come and do a quote on remodeling part of our bathroom because there's a sort of a water problem with the bathtub. So he had tried to sell me like the most expensive thing in the world, right? And he came back around and called me up and was really trying to convince me, to spend all this money and do this thing. So there's a very convincing, persuasive Mercury in Sagittarius, really trying to glamorize my consciousness and get me to buy something. So you be very careful of people trying to sell you things with that kind of enthusiasm right now. On the other hand, there are times in life where we need to recognize that there is something other than ourselves. Mercury in Jupiter can be sort of stubbornly prideful and individualistic in its thinking. So let me tell you a story and tell me if this, you guys tell me if this resonates or not. Probably this has happened to you before. How many of you have ever been in a relationship with someone? You sit down and you try to tell them very honestly, without attacking them, from a vulnerable place, that they've disappointed you or that they are upset, that they've upset you. Okay. And then that person proceeds to make you feel even worse than you did before because they aren't able to hear you. How many of you have had that happen before? That is like one of my biggest pet peeves in the world. When I sit down, there's a rational, calm, non-offensive or aggressive, like, I need to tell you, you hurt my feelings about something. And the person goes on the defensive. They make it all about themselves. They're not hearing you. And now you feel even more hurt or wounded because you thought to approach them in the first place. And then that makes you not want to talk to them. It makes you not want to go to them in the future with your problems. And then they start resenting you because they feel like you don't like them. And, oh God, is it still really all about them? Does this sound familiar? Okay. So we all deal with this in relationships. This happens in a lot of times in different kinds of relationships with family members, etc. What to speak of nationally, globally, right? How many, like, if you could boil it down, all of the different kinds of groups that battle with one another, in one sense, doesn't it sort of boil down to some of the disagreements? I'm not, not all disagreements are equal, right? But I see this a lot on social media because I'm on social media a lot. One person tries to say in honest vulnerability that they feel wronged or that they feel a group has been marginalized or something in an honest way. They're trying to have an honest conversation. And the person on the other side makes it all about themselves. And then it's like nothing can happen. No empathizing can occur. No crossing over the bridge and trying to make amends and trying to understand one another. Like, it doesn't happen because the person feels threatened about the possibility of being wrong. Let's not forget, I live to be corrected. I live to be a servant. That's what we're here for, really. to be a servant to the divine. And from that connection, if we keep that at the center of our lives, we can be servants to one another. We can be neighbors to one another. This is why the most popular movie over the summer, as far as I can tell, was a movie about Mr. Rogers, for God's sake. I love Mr. Rogers, but like, that's where we're at, But this is the truth on the other side too, is that, the other side of things is that sometimes we're so set in our complaint, right? We're so set in our complaint that we can't make ourselves vulnerable. We can't bring down our complaint so that someone could learn to hear it. Because a lot of the times the thing is that someone who's wronged us oftentimes is in ignorance. They're in unconsciousness. And as much as it sucks to have to be the better person, as much as we feel entitled to not have to be the bigger person, the spiritual teaching is that we have to be the bigger person, and we have to try to help a person understand what they've done in tolerance, in patience, and in peace. So we have to try. We have to try to be vulnerable and calm and non-aggressive in how we talk to people about how we feel that they've wronged us or how we feel harmed or hurt. But then, God, isn't it maddening when we do that and someone just makes us feel wounded all over again from doing it? It is a very big temptation in such a situation to shut down and to dig our heels in and to take on a more vindictive attitude. It's a big temptation. I think it's one of the great temptations of our moment right now. This, of course, is really deeply tied into Neptune's entire sojourn through Pisces in general, a sign that is deeply sensitive and sometimes too sensitive. On the other hand, often the whipping post for narcissists. And so some vindictiveness is bound to come up. There's witch hunts, and then there's witch hunts of the people who hunted the witches, and then there's compassion and tolerance and peace, and then all of these different things that have come up. There's real understanding from on part of perpetrators who have harmed people that can happen with Neptune and Pisces. Like victims can have a voice with Neptune and Pisces, but also there can be this sort of cyclical victimization cycle as part of Neptune and Pisces. There's really deep stuff that we're involved with right now, but I think it's also a unique moment with Neptune, Mercury in a square with Neptune, about to go retrograde, for the way that we communicate to change, to shift, for us to surrender some of our pride and our stake in the outcome. So can we imagine a space where a personal relationship, what to speak of any of our larger political or ideological or religious concerns, that when we talk to someone and we just say, this is how I feel, this is what I think, whatever, and we're trying to share openly or honestly, that our goal, our topmost takeaway, is not how the other person responds, but rather that we were able to stay centered in the heart when we spoke our piece, when we said our part, that we were in integrity and in kindness. Truth and kindness can go together. Truth doesn't have to be about manipulating, and it doesn't have to be about strong arming, and it doesn't have to be vindictive. So those are some of the big messages for the moment. And yet, again, the fiery Mercury in Sagittarius, sort of fueled by Jupiter in Sagittarius, can very much try to guilt, coerce, blame, manipulate, hijack people's emotions. So you want to be really aware of the way that can come into your communication dynamics in your relationships right now. And myself included, right? I have to stay really careful of that. One thing that I caught myself doing, for example, is this is a really subtle thing, and I think you'll understand though. My daughter was she's going through her terrible twos right now, so to speak, and she has a lot of meltdowns over things that seem really trivial, especially compared to where she was like a couple of months ago, right? So it's these ebbs and flows in like her development, and when I'm frustrated with her, and she's in a space where she's not necessarily listening to me, sometimes there's a temptation that I have it's going to sound really awful. I promise, I promise I'm not a bad person. But there's a temptation that I have in front of my daughter when she's not listening to vent my frustration with her to my wife in the hopes that her hearing me talk to my wife about my frustration with her will get through to her. That's not cool, right? Like but we do stuff like that all the time, really subtly in everyday communication dynamics. Our frustration, our impatience, and gets the better of us sometimes, and we come up with really subtle manipulative ways of trying to get a point across or trying to get something accomplished or whatever. Like shaming my daughter for her behavior by talking about how much I don't like it to my wife in frustration, and hoping that my frustration and my sort of shaming of her sort of publicly will work better than patient, direct conversation with her. Like I caught myself doing that last night, and I was like, oh man, like this parenting is so hard. Like I don't want to be that guy. You know what I mean? Like I don't want to do that. What to speak of like all of the the countless encounters that I'm going to have with her, like when I'm just like imagining what it's going to be like when she's a teenager. Like what will I do? Well, you know what I mean? So, but I'm thankful that I have astrology in my life, because I could sit back and I could be like, hey, that's Mercury square Neptune. I know exactly why I did that. I know exactly where that temptation was coming from. Okay, so I've labored with Mercury square Neptune for a while now. I hope that nobody's flight is delayed. I hope nobody, spills water on the keyboard, and I hope that we're all nice and neighborly to one another. So we'll leave it there. I'm going to turn now to Q&A. We'll be talking more about Mars entering Pisces and squaring Jupiter, Venus turning direct. There's a lot more to talk about this month. So, okay, so I'm going to go to some Q&A that I received, and let's just open up that Q&A folder here. So the first question, which is really interesting, comes from Kat Rose. Look up Kat Rose on YouTube, by the way. She has this channel for creative introverts, and I listened to part of the first video, and I found it really interesting as someone who is more introverted and was taught from an early age that there was sort of something wrong with being introverted. I found it really refreshing to listen to some of her videos. So thanks, Kat, for submitting your question. And her question is, you've mentioned yoga a few times now, and as a new yoga teacher, I've been working on ways to integrate yoga asana practice with astrology. I'm familiar with Diane's work at Yoga Astrology, but I'm wondering if you've seen any connection or way of working with the two together, or if it's a bit of a stretch. Well, I do have friends and other practitioners who are into the yoga astrology thing. I'm not per se, but if that appeals to you, I don't see why you couldn't, get more interested in that. One thing I will say is that having my wife and I own a yoga studio, and being a yoga teacher myself, and encountering this question really more times than I could count since opening a yoga studio, because a lot of our teachers and students who come through obviously know that I'm an astrologer, and so they're like, hey, is there any way to incorporate yoga and astrology together? And my answer has always been very simple. It's to be creative. Yoga, but what is the purpose of yoga, really, right? The purpose of yoga, asana, physical postures, originally within the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, is really just a sort of preliminary set of exercises that you might do in the morning before you get ready to meditate for a really long time. Put really simply, asana kind of, it's kind of like getting up and you see a cat or a dog stretch out when they first get up in the morning. Before you're going to sit for a really long time, if that's sort of your job as a yogi, your body's got to be ready to sit. So, in a sense, like yoga is it's just there to prepare you for meditation. The real yoga is not postures. It's not, in fact, one of the things, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, I'm not trying to say anything that you or Kat, you or anyone may not already know, but just for people who don't know, who are listening, the real purpose of doing yoga is to link ourselves, to re-link ourselves back to the divine, because the idea of yoga philosophy is that we get lost in the illusion that we are only material. and that and that all that exists is just the material changing stuff of the world. When in fact the claim of the Yoga Sutras and yoga philosophy in general is that we are divine. We're divine and eternal beings, part of the larger whole. And so the point of a life of yogic practice, real yogic practice, right, is to be moving into daily lifestyle and daily committed sadhana practice that helps us to absorb ourselves in the reality of ourselves as spirit souls in a loving relationship with the divine. Like that's basically like the essence of what we're doing with yoga in a nutshell. Asanas are just one part of how we're doing that, right? Asanas are just like, it's just, again, it's, you could think of it very simply as like, conscious breathing in the body, trying to kind of work out the kinks. But it in and of itself, yoga asana has never been like the full extent of yoga. In fact, it's a much more recent development in the history of sort of yogic practices. Most of the asanas that we see in modern day yoga studios are actually things that came from part of the way that the Indian boys in the Indian army were being trained with sort of fusion of like yogic asanas and sort of British calisthenics. Like it's very, all these asanas and all these crazy poses that people do, and then they post themselves on Instagram, like, come follow me down to Costa Rica, we'll get half naked and I'll show you how to do a headstand or whatever. Like none of that is yoga, right? Just to be totally blunt, like none of that is yoga in the sense that it's an interesting, it might be relaxing, it might be physically restoring. Heck, I'd like to go to Costa Rica. I've been before. I love it down there. But that's not yoga unless it's also part of an active intention to re-link yourself to the divine. Like that's just it. If you can, it's not that people shouldn't do it, but unless that's the intention behind it, it's not, sort of traditional yoga. So you see people doing things like, beer yoga and like all sorts of crazy stuff nowadays. It's not yoga. Similarly on Instagram, all I have to do is pop open to Instagram and look at any of the streaming pictures that are posted on Instagram. And what you'll see almost instantly is, men and women showing off their bodies, trying to project sexual appeal in different yoga postures, and usually also an aura of wealth and like privilege that sort of goes along with it. And I feel like I have been guilty of it myself at times. But as my commitment to yoga has evolved and grown, as I think it does for a lot of people if they stick with it over time, the real intention of yoga starts to creep in on the heart. It starts to say, this is the asanas are just part of the linking of the heart to God. And that's like that. So the asanas start to fade. And really, like, again, like most of the postures that you see people doing, especially the more difficult, crazy ones, the original postures in India are very, very simple, not like that at all. There's almost like, and it's part of kind of, you could say, almost like a morning routine that people do as they're, again, preparing to do a lot of time in prayer and meditation or chanting and things like that. So I say all of this because when people link astrology that is, let's say, all about making yourself feel good, and it's all about, trying to manifest all the stuff that you want, and it goes along, it somehow is meant to go along with some kind of, gymnastic exercise routine. Neither astrology nor yoga in that case would be used for the correct purpose. So that's the first thing, is to just sort of say what it isn't. But then what it is also has to be said. And this is where I always tell people to get creative. The purpose of yoga practice for a lot of people in the world is to help, even if it's just little drop doses, to help them start cultivating a taste for trying to establish that uplink to the divine. And getting relaxed in your body, having mindfulness, feeling more empowered in your body, feeling like you're beautiful, like those things are important just to build self-esteem, which sometimes we don't have, it's crippled. All of that's important. Taking time out, taking time to rest, nice shavasana. Like these things that yoga studios provide, I'm not at all antagonistic about, otherwise I wouldn't have a yoga studio. But they, again, like the most important thing is that if you're going to incorporate astrology with yoga, you have to understand, what are people coming to yoga to get? And it's usually just that sense of connection to something bigger through peace, relaxation, breath, more mindfulness, basic level stuff that helps slowly creating a more fully committed spiritual lifestyle that takes place over time. And the teacher has to be content to help water that plant just very gradually. When you bring in astrology, you have to be very careful, because if you bring it in and it feels too esoteric and overwhelming for, let's say, suburban moms or students, or someone who's trying to work out an injury from an accident or something like that, and it gets too esoteric and too sort of blown out, you can kill the plant. They'll be like, yeah, yoga's crazy. So the most important thing is not to use astrology in a way that can freak people out, because a lot of people have a hard time opening up to yoga itself, what to speak of opening up to something like astrology in the midst of their yoga class. So be very careful of that. But the other thing would be that there are creative ways that you can incorporate that are really, I think, beautiful. For example, let's say that there's a whole bunch of planets in fire signs. A very simple thing that you could do is just to say, hey, a lot of planets have moved into fire signs recently. And in astrology, astrologers everywhere are teaching us to see the symbolic connection between the things happening in the sky and the things happening in the world. All these planets move into fire signs, and there's this big fire out west. And fire is also related to fear. You say stuff like that. One of the elements that is related to fear and anxiety, and the pressure to act and do something, or the fight or flight response comes up with fire. I know as a teacher this past week, I've been feeling really stressed out. So I thought, because of all of this interesting stuff that the astrologers are speaking of course, you may know, you could say that astrologers have, yoga has an ancient link to astrology. Astrology was one of the sister sciences of yoga, say something like that. I thought we would start off by trying to do you could do, if you wanted to be sort of homeopathic, like treats light, do some breath of fire to start the class. If you wanted to try to cool or calm things down a little bit, because this class feels really fiery and intense, you mention that, and then you say, we're going to do something calming and cooling, is a more gentle yin or restorative like class or something like that. I think the main advice that I would give, though, is to look at the influences, keep in touch with them daily as an astrologer, and then try to bring something that either matches them to sort of match the moment and move into the intelligence of what's in the sky, in the body, or try to cool, calm, or counterbalance something that might be emphasized to an unhealthy an unhealthy way. Well, those are the basic ways that I tell people, and just keep it really simple and be aware of your audience. Okay, so that's my thing there. I notice that someone says he has a wily look about him, and then the next one says, oops, sorry, that was meant to be in a PM of something entirely different. I'm just hoping that I'm the one who looks wily, because that would be probably the coolest thing that I've heard today. So, all right, so let's go to the next question from Alex. Alex has this question that was, I'm going to read it because it's actually kind of funny. He says, how do you, or what are some ways you reconcile tradition with evolution in the study of astrology? I've never run across an astrologer so passionate about tradition, which is one reason I enjoy your talks. So wondering maybe your top two or three, quote, these are things I incorporate into traditional astrology for modern understanding because, and top 2 or 3, these are modern understandings that are total BS from your perspective. Cool. So that's a really good question, and I'll try to answer it. I have to switch over to my notes. I wrote down a few notes for this one. So here's my answer here in terms of what are, things that I incorporate in traditional astrology for modern understanding. Probably the top 3 things are this. Modern era has wed astrology very effectively to depth psychology. From Jung and Freud and Hillman and forward, people like Liz Green, Richard Tarnas, so this kind of archetypal depth psychology approach where the chart can illuminate psychological exploration. I think that is a hugely valuable contribution that the modern era has made that was not as emphasized in previous eras as I think it is now. At least it doesn't appear that way to me as a student of previous eras of astrology. So I think that's a really unique thing that modern astrology brings that I think is deeply valuable. And I am sure to incorporate that kind of the psychological richness of the modern tradition into the way that I teach traditional astrology, which is why I teach a course called Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. Coming your way December 1st, Saturdays. Sign up. Okay, so then the second thing that I would take from modern astrology that I think is hugely valuable are outer planets and asteroids. Outer planets and asteroids, while I use them in very specific ways compared to a modern practitioner who I would say uses them probably all the time. I tend to practice within the traditional framework. But I think that the modern outer planets and asteroids add this just incredible kind of richness to the language of astrology. They offer us a unique sort of new set of symbols to work with, and I think they're very powerful in that respect. However, I have to add this little qualification, which is that I think that sometimes we unfortunately think about the difference between the use of modern outer planets and only using the traditional planets in an overly polarized way, meaning people who are in the modern sort of school of astrology will say, if you don't use the outer planets, you're not using the most objective, complete view and understanding of the cosmos, and so your astrology is like deficient, like that. Ancient astrologers, on the other hand, can make, sort of traditional astrologers can make the argument that, you don't really need those planets. The traditional 7 says everything you need to know, and the outer planets are just, frivolous and, no need for them. And it's kind of this like, I'll just stick to my tradition, and so neither of those views are appropriate. In my opinion, they're just going to keep butting heads. So here's how I look at it. I see astrology very similar to an elaborate tarot deck in the sky. I see it as a beautiful, symbolic, divinatory language. The thing that makes it work more than anything is the intentionality of the practitioner and the purity and openness of the mind and heart of the practitioner. If they have that combined with a study and respect for consistent use of methodology, whether it's outer planets or traditional planets, I think that the divine speaks. And I think that you can speak, you can describe accurately, you can predict accurately, and more than importantly, you can make meaningful connections with people, and they'll be served by astrology. Astrology will help them grow closer to God. It'll open their heart to that link with the divine in a real way. That's it. And from there, the debate between using more or less to me is like this. Do you use the Thoth tarot deck, or do you use the Rider-Waite? Do you like to use the major arcana alone, or do you also like to incorporate like all of the suited cards? I don't care, right? To me, that whether it's a complete objective picture of the cosmos or not, that's an illusion, as well as thinking that only the tradition is correct is an illusion. I see both of them as extremely just misguided visions of what astrology actually is, which again is a symbolic language that has the power to speak. It's a collection of beautiful signs and omens in the sky. And if you want to use outer planets because you're a practitioner of the outer planets, that's awesome. If you do it with integrity consistently, you'll develop a rapport with those symbols and they will have power to speak. On the other hand, there's no problem with only working with the traditional 7 planets. They will speak too. And in my opinion, not because the outer planets are, not original or not adding anything unique, but because there's also no need to think that more is better. Less can also be really effective. In fact, I think one of the things that I teach in my traditional astrology course is like learning to work with the traditional planets alone in the beginning is so powerful, because you'll learn how to be more concise and more efficient. And a lot of the times we can't do that because we have too many symbols in the chart in the beginning, and we're just scrambling, and then all that ends up coming out of us are, cliches. We end up with a short list of adjectives because rather than deepening our understanding of a core set of symbols, we've expanded to too many too quickly. So while I am not against the outer planets, I teach in my traditional astrology for modern times course the whole first year only the traditional planets, so that people can get to know them and develop a really deep rapport with them and their sort of nuances. For example, today I had no outer planets in a chart that I was working with. I was able to see something through technical language of Hellenistic astrology that was very, sort of accurate. And the client was like, "Oh, I always just thought that was my Pluto moon." Right? And I was like, "Well, yeah, it's your Pluto moon too. You can use that symbol to talk about it as well." And they were like, "I don't know, traditional astrologer." You can kind of feel that sometimes from people like, I think I need Pluto there for it to really be real. And I'm like, no, you don't. There's lots of different things in the sky. There's lots of different things in the language that could speak to the same thing. That's not to say that Pluto isn't its own vast, deep, unique symbol as well that could also speak to the same thing. You see, when we look at the sky as the sparkling oracles of the divine, and we really want to listen, then usually it doesn't matter if we have maxed out with 50 billion asteroids and all the outer planets or just the core 7. It depends on how we're wired, the way that we're going to learn to read. So at any rate, the outer planets. Finally, the increased role of the individual and the understanding of a broader collective consciousness. In modern astrology, one of the great gifts of modern astrology is that the role of my individual dignity as a person has increased. Of course, there's some ego that goes along with that might not be so great. You're not just a cog in a machine as you were in other eras in history, though. I think most sociologists and historians sort of agree that more of the emphasis on the individual has grown, and I think there's really positive place for modern astrology. Really honors the individual, and I think that's important. And also the awareness of a broader collective consciousness, the work of people like Richard Tarnas, Dane Rudyard, just people who are saying, let's be aware of the zeitgeist, let's be aware of how the planets speak to the larger movements. Thank God we have that, because now we have a global society basically, and it's really helpful to see the archetypes at work in humanity as a whole. And I think that's a really unique contribution of modern astrology. Not that ancient astrology didn't have an understanding of vaster kind of cosmic cycles and greater groups of people, but it's just especially the outer planets have really helped us to just broaden our understanding of the collective movements of history and the collective unconscious and the soul of the world, the anima mundi, and things like that. Now, in terms of the things that I don't like about modern astrology that I think are sort of BS, and I'll tell you what I think is BS about traditional astrology too. Sometimes in modern astrology, you are your chart. It's encouraged to get identified very personally with your chart, as evidenced by you mention one thing that's happening, and someone will you mention one transit that's happening in a horoscope, and someone will write like 5 paragraphs about the most ridiculously complicated set of aspects happening in their chart. And at the end, it's just incomprehensible. You're just like, what are you talking about? This is just astrological navel gazing. So like the sort of, you are your chart. You are your chart. And that getting really identified and wrapped up in it, I think that's really problematic. I think that is sort of the shadow of some of the individualism of modern astrology. Hypersubjectivity, right? I can twist the symbols because I'm not using a classical language that has more a goal of describing things and predicting things in a more objectively accurate manner. That again, it's like modern era sometimes like, well, there is no objectivity. Everything's relative. Well, some things are relative, but other things aren't relative. And a chart should be able to describe accurately how you act and behave, what kinds of things are going to happen on a certain level, should be able to predict things that are going to happen. Modern astrology in some ways, to me, is not very good at recognizing like objective reality sometimes. It's so inner, it's so process and inner oriented that it's not very good at being as predictively accurate or even descriptively accurate. And I also feel that part of that is because of the loss of the traditional language, which rather than feeling, a lot of times modern astrologers will say that it's prescriptive or heavy or whatever. And I don't find it to be that way at all. And I find that most of that judgment about traditional astrology comes from people who literally know very little about traditional astrology. So that's kind of my beef there. Hyper-positivism, the chart is just all about trying to make you feel good. And a reading, if it doesn't make you feel good, it means that the astrologer is, dark or heavy or negative. And the goal is truth, right? The goal is truth. It was Firmicus Maternus who said, in fact, I'll show you something cool. This is a little astrological artifact that I got for taking some photos on my website. I got this neat little compass. It's kind of cool. On the back, it is engraved a Firmicus Maternus quote: "Those who engage in the prediction of the future and the truth, having acquired a soul that is free and not enslaved, live their lives undaunted by disturbances, by training their souls to be confident." The similar desire to live to be corrected, to live to improve our understanding of things, to get closer to the truth of who we are and what is real, is similarly there in this quote, that we engage in prediction of the future, an accurate description of what's happening, so that we might not be enslaved by our whims and desires. Sometimes I feel that modern astrology lacks that need for objectivity and replaces it with the desire to make people feel good, and like everything is just this one big, great, process-oriented self-help trip. And I don't like that, because it doesn't feel real to me. And I feel like as someone who has a really kind of strict daily practice, I feel like to really grow spiritually, we have to learn how to deal with constraints and dislikes and difficulties. And I feel like ancient astrology brings some of that in, because it's more willing to sort of square up to the way that things are, even when they're bad or difficult. Ultimately, they're not bad or difficult, but how can we possibly expect to transcend the dualities of the world if we're not even able to admit that they exist? Do you know what I mean? One of the things that I don't like about the New Age in general is the lack of recognition in evil or bad or darkness. And I also don't like the way that the idea of a higher divine will that orchestrates and directs our lives is discarded in favor of individual will determining everything. I don't like that. To me, it feels out of touch with reality. And so even though I do believe we have choice and agency, and our will is valid and beautiful, but I feel like there's too much of this like emphasis on personal will and hyper positivity and all of that. So that's my beef with like some forms of modern astrology. Not that all modern astrology is like that, right? The other thing I don't like about modern astrology is the corruption of the meaning of the nodes of the moon. I've talked about this before, but I have a lot of friends who are evolutionary astrologers, and I think that they do meaningful and good work. Despite that, I still feel like the nodes of the moon are just dead wrong in the evolutionary tradition. I feel like there's not a healthy, good understanding of what the nodes of the moon are. The history of astrology teaches us that there's never been a really hard claim that the North Node is all about your lessons that you're supposed to be learning, and the South Node is where you come from or what you've gained or learned in the past, in previous lives and future lives. They're a bit more enigmatic and esoteric than that. And I think that their interpretation in charts requires more patience and a more thoughtful treatment. I believe that part of the reason that paradigm has been effective and healing for many people, like including myself, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for some of that paradigm. But one of the reasons I have a problem with it in general is that I believe that it's promoting a kind of progress, futurized vision of spiritual life. Like I'm progressing, I'm evolving, it's future oriented, I'm taking action, I'm learning my lessons, but it's still in some ways just about me. And I see the purpose of spiritual life not about me and growth and enlightenment and progress and evolution. I see it as surrendering my attachment to future outcomes and learning to love without motivation the divine. I see it as a different kind of thing. That's not to say we don't have lessons that we're here to learn, but the whole like evolutionary paradigm just sort of bothers me for that reason. I'm just trying to be really open and honest about it. That being said, that doesn't mean that people can't grow within that paradigm. Even the Dalai Lama has said that the sort of illusion, the sort of temporary illusion that we're progressing and learning lessons and moving in some hierarchical fashion toward some kind of realized state, is maybe temporarily beneficial for people. So that's how I feel about it. But I feel when it becomes a really dominant dogma, I think that it gets really far away from what the ancient tradition of astrology was about, which was more of a healthy detachment. As evidence for this, in India, the north node of the moon is treated as something that represents desires and hungers and appetites for gain, but they complicate your life and they entangle you more in karma. Whereas the south node of the moon is connected more with austerity, loss, and decline, but it may bring you closer to detachment from the material world. It's a vast difference from the way that a lot of evolutionary astrologers treat the nodes of the moon. So and what to speak of the way that the Greeks talked about them, which is also very different. So that's another beef that I have, it's superficial, but the question was asked. So I'm not going to like spend time, like when I see my evolutionary friends at the next astrology conference, I'm going to be like, hey, something stupid like that. But at any rate, that's, my beef. Finally, outer planetary rulerships of signs. You've probably heard me rail on this before. I don't think outer planets rule signs. That's just it. If you study the dignities of traditional astrology well enough, the thema mundi, aspect theory, the joys, the hemispheric division of the joys, the exaltations, the way that the whole system was arranged in these really interpenetrating, complex, beautiful ways, like a woven tapestry, it doesn't make sense to throw in the planets as more rulers without a much deeper and more comprehensive look at traditional astrology, which the modern astrologers were not doing, did not have access to when they assigned those rulerships. So I think that there are interesting archetypal associations between planets and signs and planets and houses that you can make. But guess what? You can make them ad infinitum. There's plenty to be made. And I think that sometimes we mistake in this modern era, there's so much emphasis on literary critique of society and history and everything like that, that we can mistake archetypal, mythological, symbolic associations with the symbolic methodologies of delineation in a birth chart. So associations that we can make in a clever way, or even in a really intelligent way, do not mean that they will be the right associations to make in terms of delineating a birth chart. So I'm very cautious about people just kind of freewheeling with all of the mythological and like sort of literary associations between planets and signs and houses. I think it's very interesting. It can be really fruitful, and especially in a more of a sort of therapeutic setting with astrology. But in terms of trying to predict and delineate, karma in a sort of more concrete sense, I think that the outer planets need to be in their own category. They're not really to be shoehorned into the classical system, especially by people who don't really understand it and think that, well, just because the planet has a few things in common with the god it was named after, or a house or a sign, that should rule that sign. So I have real problems with that. Other thing I have a problem with is the 12-letter alphabet, where people think that the meaning of the 6th house coincides with Virgo, and the meaning of the 8th with Scorpio, and the meaning of the 12th with Pisces. Again, in ancient astrology, you don't really see that kind of correlation being made between the houses and signs. So I really don't. That's another thing that I think is really unfortunate, because I think it really thinks that it leads people astray and it conflates too many different symbols together, when understanding the unique rationale behind the difference between planets, signs, and houses, it really differentiates your palette, so to speak. It makes you a much more intelligent and precise articulator of what you're seeing in a chart. That's why I love ancient astrology for the most part, is that it really makes everything, gives a lot more finer distinctions to things. And then I think that can do nothing but help. Even if you're not into traditional astrology so much, you still want to do more modern psychological based work with people. I still think knowing that traditional language, it could still help in a therapeutic psychological setting. The 3 things I don't like about traditional astrology: it can be too predictive, which isn't good, without some psychological depth, without some therapeutic context. I think it can be heavy-handed and too predictive and too prescriptive, and that's not a good thing. Traditional astrology can worship at the altar of the past as much as modern astrology can worship at the altar of the future. The past is what's great, and some people in modern astrology, no, it's all about the future and how much we've evolved over time. I think when you see time as cyclical, which is part of how I view time, you get away from thinking that the past is better than the future or vice versa. It's really thinking about an eternal kind of present. Yeah, again, Nicholas is making the comment that they use the 12-letter alphabet with a lot of success in the Vedic tradition. Success does not mean that they're correct, right? And that's a beautiful thing about astrology, is that astrology is I think, very flexible in the way that you can work with lots of different signs and symbols and associations between things. But I don't believe that that was where the original inspiration for the topics of the houses came from. I believe that's a mistake. So there's lots of reasons you could debate about that. But I would recommend, again, checking out the original meanings of the houses talk that I just had posted on Nadia's site. Nadia posted on her site today, which kind of goes into a hypothesis that I personally believe is much more accurate. Anyway, so I don't like the 12-letter alphabet. I think it does a lot of harm. I think it's also a different thing in India because you have a system over there that is also much closer to the integrity of the traditional methods. So, I mean, it wouldn't bother me as much if people were using the 12-letter alphabet if they were also, using a lot more traditional concepts and techniques like the planetary yogas that they use in India or lots of other things. So that's another kind of separate conversation. But I take your point very well that I think people do use it with success, with some level of success. But I think it's like, it's like a lot of things. Like you can, for example, you can play a drum, with great success, and there could still be a better, more effective way of playing it. So, it may be just one of those things where it's really not that important. It's just, one of those neurotic things that drives me nuts personally. But at any rate, in traditional astrology, you can worship at the altar of the past. You can, you can be overly prescriptive or concrete. And the other thing is that you, kind of to Nicholas's point, you can also, you can get on a superiority trip about the methods and about everything being more accurate and better and stuff like that. And, I feel like traditional astrology is catching on because it's a beautiful, compelling thing. Especially, I think that one of the reasons it's catching on is because, especially with a younger generation, is that when the newness of anything, it eventually has an expiration date. And if the modern astrological movement has promoted a lot of interiority, personal, psychological interpretation and depth and personal growth and healing through a more kind of fluid, dynamic relationship with your birth chart, you're getting more personally identified with it. And there's something about that that's been, I think, really useful and liberating. But I think when it gets old, when it ages, it starts, I think for a younger generation, I've heard this said so many times from younger people who like traditional astrology, for example, which seems kind of weird, is that it also starts appearing narcissistic. It appears like people who are kind of, again, sort of lost in their own trip, in which case objectivity is needed. And I think some healthy objectivity has been brought into the mix with traditional astrology. But the point is to bring it into the mix. So again, that's why I teach a class called Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. I think the purpose ultimately is to make meaningful bridges between these different eras. So that is my answer for that. This has been a long one and an hour and a half today. I thank all of you for hanging around for this. And I look forward to talking to you guys in the rest of the week. There's a lot of big transits to come. So have a wonderful evening. And don't forget, my new class is coming up on Saturdays starting December 1st. You can check it out on the courses page of my website, which is www.nightlightastrology.com. Hope to see some of you there. Okay, bye.